Hi and welcome to Really Understanding Incoterms 2020, a series of comprehensive masterclasses. I'm Bob Ronai, and this is lesson number 11, the first of three about DPU, delivered at place, unloaded, named place of destination. But first, the inevitable disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer. The contents of this course are not legal advice. I was a member of the International Chamber of Commerce's Incoterms 2020 drafting group, which created these rules. Some of the contents of this lesson are direct quotes from the Incoterms 2020 publication, number 723E of the ICC. My explanations, my comments and my opinions are based on my knowledge and my experience of over 5 decades. My intent in creating this comprehensive course on Incoterms 2020 is to ensure that my knowledge and my experience is passed on to you for a better future in trade for you. In this lesson, we will look specifically at DPU, the more complex and contentious articles yet again. A2 and B2, delivery and taking delivery, with its two options and problems for FCLs and LCLs. Then in the next two lessons, we'll look at the other modes of transport, plus A10, B10 notices, A6 and B6 delivery and transport document, A9 and B9 allocation of costs, and A5, B5 insurance, plus letter of credit issues. As always, I will explain what the book says first, which is where the others stop or don't even get to, but then I will examine the many issues arising from these articles as we go along. I guess the question arises, why did it take 3 lessons to explain DAP and DDP, and why is it taking another 3 lessons to explain DPU? Because the rules themselves explain that the seller has an obligation to deliver at a named place in the destination country without any further explanation what that means. This might be fine for lawyers to occasionally ponder over from their generally very limited understanding of logistics, but it is no help whatsoever to the sellers, buyers, transport operators, freight forwarders, bankers and others who are in some way directly or indirectly affected by these rules. I hope that my explanations help the widespread understanding of these rules and how they can and cannot be used correctly. A2, delivery. The seller must unload the goods from the arriving means of transport and must then deliver them by placing them at the disposal of the buyer, at the agreed point if any, at the named place of destination, or by procuring the goods so delivered. In either case, the seller must deliver the goods on the agreed date or within the agreed period. This rule covers any mode or combinations of modes. There's usually a choice of 2 destinations in practice, even though these are not even mentioned in the book. They are the less frequently used destination terminal and the much more common concept of buyer's nominated premises. But can this rule always function for each mode of transport? Well, let's see. But first, the IMO, ILO, UNECE Code of Practice for Packing of Cargo Transport Units, the CTU Code, January 2014, is very clear that a container, a cargo transport unit, is dealt with separately from the goods inside it. The container is not packaging of the goods, except in the rare cases of shipper or consignee-owned containers. Packaging, such as pallets, shrink wrap, crates, cartons, etc., is supplied by the seller and retained or disposed of by the buyer and included in the price of the goods separate to the freight cost. A container, on the other hand, is supplied by the carrier and returned to them as part of the contract of carriage. Let's look at a full container load DPU destination terminal, CY. DPU is not appropriate for delivery of an FCL at a CY, a container yard. This is because the seller cannot arrange unloading of the goods from the container in the container yard. Therefore, the DAP rule should be used. A2, delivery of a full container load, DPU buyer's premises. I just mentioned here the buyer must arrange all import formalities. The seller pays terminal handling charges and must contract at its own cost and risk for the container to then be taken from the container yard to the buyer's premises for the seller to unload. Then the empty container must be cleaned and returned to the carrier's container yard at the seller's cost. The contract of sale really should be very clear, specifying a maximum time allowed in the container yard at the seller's expense, the free time, after which all the storage and demurrage detention are for the buyer while they complete any delayed import formalities. The contract of sale should be clear that the buyer will allow the seller a specific number of hours to unload the container, and any truck delay charges beyond that time are to be reimbursed to the seller. The seller should be aware that if the buyer fails to accept delivery of the container at their premises, then the carrier will charge all storage, demurrage and detention to the seller. In case of the buyer defaulting, trying to then return the container or send it to another country might be impossible due to the export rules in the buyer's country. The seller needs to be aware of many potential problems in carrying out its obligation to deliver unloaded into the buyer's premises. The seller must arrange for its carrier to unload the goods from the container on its truck. That means it must provide the machinery, maybe a forklift and a side loader or a crane, and labour to do so. The buyer, on the other hand, may want to know who those people are, their criminal history, their work permits, visas, etc., and may require them to do a site induction. The buyer also may require from the seller or its carrier evidence of suitable insurances, such as accident, public liability, workers' compensation, etc., plus confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement. A further complication is the coordination of the logistics at destination. 1. The seller's forwarder arranges for carriage from the origin into the container yard. 2. The buyer must arrange import formalities, usually via a customs broker or separately via the seller's forwarder at the buyer's risk and cost. 3. The customs broker then hands any necessary container release documents to that local forwarder or agent or trucking company, which must be known to it, to obtain the container from the container yard. 4. The local agent of the seller's forwarder then contracts for trucking of the container from the container yard to the buyer's premises at the seller's risk and cost. 5. The seller's carrier unloads the goods from the container and sweeps it out. 6. The seller is responsible for return of the empty container to the carrier's terminal. And 7. Any container detention charge will be billed by the carrier to the seller's forwarder, who will bill the seller, as it will also for any truck delay charge beyond an agreed time. This concept occasionally pops up, DPU destination port. While the seller's contract of carriage includes discharge of the container from the vessel and its move into the container yard, this is not unloading the goods as they remain in the container. Unloading is necessarily one complete action at one time and place, so this usage would be simply inappropriate. A2 delivery of an LCL, less than full container load, DPU destination terminal or CFS container freight station. The contract of sale should be very clear that from the moment the goods are unloaded, meaning delivered as an A2 from the consolidated container in the CFS, all further terminal handling charges, storage and demurrage are for the buyer because they occur after delivery. The buyer, of course, must arrange all import formalities, and the buyer will contract for the goods to be taken from the CFS to their premises at their own cost. LCL DPU buyer's premises. The contract of sale should be very clear, specifying a maximum time allowed in the CFS after availability of the goods at the seller's expense, usually the free time, after which all subsequent storage, demurrage, detention are for the buyer. The buyer, of course, must arrange all import formalities. The seller must contract at its own cost for the packages of goods to then be taken from the CFS to the buyer's premises for the seller to unload from the delivering vehicle. The contract of sale should be clear that the buyer will allow the seller a specific number of hours to unload the truck, and any truck delay charges beyond that time are to be reimbursed to the seller. The seller should be aware that if the buyer fails to accept delivery of the goods, then the carrier will charge all CFS storage, demurrage and detention to the seller. In case of the buyer defaulting, trying to then return the goods or send them to another country might be impossible due to the export rules in the buyer's country. The seller needs to be aware of many potential problems in carrying out its obligation to deliver unloaded into the buyer's premises. The seller, for example, must arrange for its carrier to unload the goods from the truck. That means it must provide the machinery, maybe a forklift or a crane, and labour to do so. The buyer may want to know who those people are, their criminal history, their work permits, their visas, etc., and may require them to do a site induction. The buyer may require from the seller or its carrier evidence of suitable insurances such as accident, public liability, workers' compensation, etc., plus confidentiality and non-disclosure agreement. There's still another problem to consider. When a seller contracts with its forwarder to transport LCL goods, that forwarder very often then contracts with a consolidator, because that forwarder may well not pack its own consolidated containers for most destinations. The consolidator then ships to its agent at destination, and the forwarder may well have no connections with that consolidator. And even worse is if there is an intermediary consolidator involved. A further complication is simply the coordination of the logistics at destination. 1. The seller's forwarder arranges for carriage from origin into the CFS and unloading from the consolidated container. The buyer must arrange import formalities, usually via a customs broker or separately via the seller's forwarder, but at the buyer's risk and cost. The customs broker must know the identity of the seller's forwarder or their local agent or its trucking company. The customs broker then hands any necessary release documents for the goods to that local forwarder, agent or trucking company to obtain the goods from the container freight station. 5, the forwarder, local agent, trucking company, then contracts at the seller's risk and cost for trucking of the goods from the CFS to the buyer's premises. 6, the seller's carrier unloads the goods from that truck. And 7, any truck delay charge will be billed by the carrier to the seller. B2, delivery, very simple. The buyer must take delivery of the goods when they have been delivered under A2. I'll just highlight a few things here. Risk of loss or damage to the goods in transit is the seller's. The seller will be in breach of the contract of sale if the goods do not reach the destination in good order and condition, and the buyer will be in breach of contract if it refuses to take delivery. In the next 2 lessons, we will continue with A2 and B2 delivery and taking delivery for air, road, rail, bulk and break bulk, A10 and B10 notices, A6 and B6 delivery and transport document, A9 and B9 allocation of costs, and A5 and B5 insurance plus letter of credit issues. As always, I will explain what the book says first, which is where the others usually stop if they get that far with this rule, but then I will examine the many issues arising from these articles as we go along. If you like this lesson, please click on the thumbs up button below. If you'd like to be alerted to each new lesson, please just hit the subscribe button and the bell. And please feel free to leave any comments and questions relevant to this lesson below. So till next lesson,